Story number 1. When I was 15, I had my first girlfriend. We lived in an upper-class neighborhood with quiet, peaceful streets. My girlfriend, Emily, lived just 2 blocks away, so I could walk to her house almost every night. One Thursday night during break, with nothing else to do, I decided to walk over to Emily's house. It was late, but since I didn't have a curfew, it wasn't a problem. The streets were empty, the air was cool, and all I could hear were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. As I walked, I started to hear strange noises around me, more specifically, behind me. At first, it was subtle, the sound of a bush shaking. I turned my head slightly but kept walking. Nothing. I dismissed it and picked up my pace. A few minutes later, I heard another noise, the distinct snap of a twig breaking. This time, I stopped and turned around completely. The street was empty, lined with neatly trimmed bushes that separated the sidewalks from people's properties. It was eerily quiet. I took a deep breath and kept walking. My heart pounded faster now, though I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was only a few houses away from Emily's place when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like footsteps, quick, light steps behind me. I turned around once more. Nothing. Now, Emily's house was in sight. My anxiety spiked, and I quickly pulled out my phone, dialing her number. "Hey," she answered immediately. "Emily, I think someone's following me," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "What? Are you serious?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. "I keep hearing noises, but every time I look, there's no one there," I explained as I stepped onto her driveway. From her bedroom window upstairs, I saw her staring down at me. She waved while still holding the phone. I waved back, relieved that I had finally made it. But then, her expression changed. "Who is that guy behind you?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. I froze. Spinning around, I locked eyes with a fully grown man crouched just 10 feet behind me, creeping toward me. I screamed and bolted for the front door, pounding on it desperately. Before I could reach the handle, the man grabbed me, his arm wrapping around my neck. My breath hitched, panic surging through me. Then, just as suddenly, he let go. He turned and sprinted into the darkness, disappearing down the street. Emily's mom flung the door open, her face pale with alarm. She yanked me inside and slammed the door shut. "What happened?" she demanded. I could barely breathe, my heart racing as Emily ran over. Between gasps, I tried to explain. Emily's mom hugged me tightly before rushing to call the police. That night, Emily's mom insisted I stay over for obvious safety reasons. She even drove me home the next morning. Story number 2. But that was only the beginning. The stormy night. The next evening, a brutal storm rolled in. The wind howled and rain pounded against the windows. My family was scattered around the house. My parents watching TV in the living room. My sister upstairs playing video games. And I was in my room, lost in a movie. I usually loved nights like this. The sound of rain was comforting. But that night, my sense of peace was shattered. A monstrous bang hit my window. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. There was someone outside. The heavy rain blurred his face, but I could make out a dark figure pounding on the glass. His muffled voice barely made it through the storm. "Help me! Please, I'm hurt!" I hesitated. My instincts screamed danger, but his voice sounded desperate. I cracked the window open just slightly. "What happened?" I shouted over the storm. "Please, let me in! I need help!" He wailed. Something felt off. "Go to the front door," I yelled before slamming the window shut. My pulse pounded as I ran to the living room. "Dad, there's a guy outside. He's saying he's hurt," I said, breathless. Before my dad could react, loud knocks boomed at the front door, followed by frantic shouts. "Help! Please, let me in!" My dad stepped toward the door, reaching for the handle. "Wait!" I grabbed his arm, my gut twisting. Something wasn't right. Just then, the house phone rang. The TV screen flashed the caller ID. It was our next-door neighbor. My dad rushed to pick up the phone. "Yeah?" His voice was tense. A pause. Then his expression darkened. "No fucksting way," he muttered. He hung up and turned to me, his face grim. "Stay away from the door," he ordered. He didn't explain. Instead, he walked cautiously to the window and peeked outside. Then, he cursed under his breath. "There's a guy crouched at the front door pounding on it," he said, "and he's holding some kind of big, sharp tool." Ice shot through my veins. My dad's voice boomed through the door. "Get the hell out of here. The cops are on their way." The pounding continued for a few moments, then abruptly stopped. Silence. The man had vanished. Minutes stretched out before my dad finally grabbed his phone and called the police. The storm raged on, but no more knocks came. No more cries for help. The police arrived and searched the area, but they found nothing. The man had disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind except wet footprints on our porch. To this day, I have no idea who he was or what he really wanted. But I do know one thing. Had my dad opened that door, we wouldn't be here to tell this story. The next time we checked, when my dad was on the phone with our neighbor, he told him that he had seen a homeless-looking man rummaging through his shed. Moments later, the man emerged, clutching a large chopping axe. The cops found the crazed man wandering the streets later that night. A few days later, it made it into the newspaper. Story number 3, A Voice in the Basement. One night, when I was a young kid, I was in the living room watching my favorite cartoon. The TV was blaring, but through the noise, I thought I heard my mom calling my name from downstairs. I called back. "What?" There was no answer. I figured she didn't hear me, but then I heard her call my name again. This time, it was clearer. I got up and made my way toward the basement door. The lights were off. As I made my way halfway down the stairs, I hesitated. The darkness swallowed the lower half of the basement, making it impossible to see anything. "Mom?" I called again. Silence. My heart started pounding. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? Something about the situation didn't feel right. I turned to go back upstairs, but before I reached the top step, I heard it again. My mother's voice, calling my name from the basement. I froze. Goosebumps prickled my skin as I turned to look back into the pitch-black void below. The hair on my arms stood up. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed for me to run. Finally, I bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over myself as I ran down the hall, practically in tears. My mom came rushing down from upstairs, concern written all over her face. Between gasps, I told her that something in the basement had been calling me, in her voice. She swore to me that she hadn't called for me. To prove there was nothing to be afraid of, she grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs to check. She came back up moments later, shaking her head. "See? Nothing's down there." But I knew what I had heard. Story number 4. Even as a kid, I could tell the difference between imagination and reality. And that voice? It wasn't my mom, the stranger on the trail. My grandpa recently told me a terrifying story. He lives about 2 hours from us, on a farm surrounded by dense woods. He's been married to my step-grandmother, Linda, for about 15 years now. They live a peaceful life, tending to their land, and enjoying the quiet. Every morning, Linda would take their Boston Terrier, Daisy, for a walk. In the evening, my grandpa would take her. One night, during sunset, my grandpa set out with Daisy on their usual dirt trail that ran alongside the woods. As he walked, he passed another person heading in the opposite direction. The figure wore a large hood, obscuring most of their face. Daisy immediately tensed up, barking and pulling at the leash, something she usually only did when she sensed something off. My grandpa gave a polite hello. The stranger didn't respond. Odd, but not unheard of. Some people just preferred to keep to themselves. As my grandpa continued walking, Daisy kept looking back, barking every few minutes. Finally, feeling uneasy, my grandpa turned around to see what had Daisy so riled up. His stomach dropped. The stranger, the one with the hood, was watching him from behind a tree not far away. A jolt of fear ran through him. He gripped Daisy's leash tighter and picked up the pace, heading back toward the house as quickly as his legs would allow. Then, he heard it, the crunch of leaves, inches behind him. Before he could react, a gloved hand clamped over his mouth and nose. He struggled, his breath catching in his throat as the man tightened his grip. Daisy went wild, barking and biting at the attacker's legs. With his free hand, my grandpa fumbled in his coat pocket, his fingers scrambling for the pepper spray he always carried. Finally, he got it out. He sprayed wildly, not even looking. The stranger screamed, releasing his grip instantly. My grandpa didn't hesitate. He ran, as fast as his old legs would carry him, back to the safety of his house. He was shaken but unharmed. To this day, he has no idea who that man was, and he never took the trail alone again. Story number 5. Growing up in California. I grew up in California for the first 14 years of my life. Our neighborhood wasn't the safest, mostly because the Crips were known to be active there. If you don't know, the Crips are one of Los Angeles' biggest street gangs. My best friend, who I always called Danny, lived 2 doors down. We had other friends, of course, but Danny and I were inseparable. One evening, as the sun was setting, we were hanging out on my porch when we saw a car creeping down the street, way too slow to be normal. Danny nudged me. "Dude, do you see that?" I nodded. The car had tinted windows, and something about it gave me a bad feeling. It pulled up in front of Danny's house and idled there. We watched in silence. Then the back door opened. A man stepped out, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. I didn't know why, but my stomach twisted. He wasn't a neighbor, and he sure as hell wasn't lost. The man took one step toward us. That was all it took. Danny and I bolted, sprinting into my house and locking the door behind us. We peeked through the blinds. The man stood there for a second, then got back in the car. The driver hit the gas, and they sped off. Danny and I never talked about it after that, but we both knew if we hadn't run, something terrible would have happened. The house with the window. My best friend Ethan and I were inseparable as kids. We'd spend our days riding bikes around town, playing video games, and getting into the usual mischief that 12-year-old boys do. One night, as we were biking through the neighborhood, we decided to check out a well-known abandoned house. It had been sitting empty for years, with rumors swirling about why no one would buy it. When we pulled up in front of the house, Ethan suddenly pointed at the window. "Look," he whispered. I pushed my bike forward and squinted at the darkened window. Someone was peering out at us. I couldn't tell if they were looking directly at us or just staring blankly into the street, but there was no mistaking it. A face sat between the curtains. Something felt off. We stood frozen for a few moments, staring. That's when we noticed something even stranger. The face never moved. Curious, we crept closer onto the driveway. When we got near enough, we realized the truth. It wasn't a real person at all. It looked like some kind of Halloween decoration, a fake head propped up in the window. But that meant someone had been inside to put it there. Being the mischievous kids we were, Ethan and I hatched a plan. We'd sneak in through the back and check it out. We stashed our bikes behind an overgrown bush on the side of the house, then tiptoed into the yard. To our surprise, the back door was unlocked. At the time, it wasn't that shocking. After all, someone had clearly already broken in to set up that creepy head. We stepped inside. The house was dark, but not pitch black. We didn't dare turn on any lights, afraid we'd expose ourselves. We made our way toward the living room, heading straight for the window to investigate the fake head. That's when we noticed the smell. It was overpowering, rotting, sour, nauseating. I reached out, grabbed the head from the windowsill, and immediately dropped it with a scream. It wasn't just heavy. It felt like real skin. A thick, dark liquid began dripping from the severed neck. I barely had time to process it before realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was real. A real, severed human head. Ethan and I stood there, stunned, our mouths hanging open. Then, above us, we heard a creak. We looked at each other. Someone was upstairs. Without another second of hesitation, we bolted for the back door, sprinted to our bikes, and rode faster than we ever had before. Not long after, the whole neighborhood learned what we had discovered. The head belonged to a victim of the Crips, left in the house as some kind of message. To this day, I wonder, had the killer still been inside the house with us? Story number 6. The salesman and the van last year. A man came to our house around 9 p.m., knocking on the door. We live in a rural area, so late-night visitors are extremely rare and almost always suspicious. I called for my mom, and she went to answer. The man introduced himself, claiming he was starting a business and asking if she liked American-made products. Then, he handed her a Clorox container as a sample. Something felt off. As he walked back toward his minivan, he casually mentioned grabbing a vacuum cleaner from the back. That's when my mom froze. The van door slid open, and inside, 5 other men were sitting. She barely hesitated. "Get your phone!" she hissed at me. I ran inside, but in my panic I couldn't find it. Instead, I grabbed my knife and crept back to the door, staying out of sight. Meanwhile, my mom threw the Clorox container onto the ground. "Get the hell off my property!" she yelled, her voice unwavering. "I'm calling the cops!" The men didn't wait around to argue. The driver slammed the van into reverse, and within seconds, they had sped off into the night. We never saw them again. Story number 7. The skiing trip. I've always been an adrenaline junkie. Mountain climbing, parasailing, scuba diving, you name it, I've done it. But skiing has always been my biggest passion. I'd go skiing upstate at least 10 times each season, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. One winter, my buddy Nick agreed to come upstate for a backcountry skiing and camping trip. For those who don't know, backcountry skiing means skiing in unmarked, off-trail areas outside of the resorts. It's exhilarating, but also dangerous. We drove 3 hours, then took back roads deep into the wilderness. Finally, we reached the spot, a remote, untouched area filled with steep slopes and deep powder. I parked my truck at the base of the hills, where we'd set up camp. As we started unloading our gear, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but an uneasiness settled in my gut. The air was still, too still. Nick noticed it too. "You feel that?" he muttered. I nodded. We weren't alone. We didn't see anything at first, but as we started hiking toward our camping spot, I glanced over my shoulder and saw movement. A figure, far too close to our truck. It wasn't another skier. They were watching us. I grabbed Nick's arm, whispering, "Someone's here." We froze, staring. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. Then, suddenly, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Lahan and I looked at each other. Neither of us said a word. We turned around, went straight back to the truck, and left. I don't know who that was, or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. If we had stayed the night, something bad would have happened. It was a perfect winter getaway, a remote, snow-covered area full of hills, ideal for skiing. I had driven my truck as far as I could before the dense trees prevented me from going any further. My friend Ethan and I began unloading our gear from the back of the truck, which included our ski equipment and camping supplies. Once we had everything, we hiked about a quarter of a mile through the thick snow, which was exhausting given how much we were carrying. Eventually, we found a clearing near the base of a hill that seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. Setting up the tent and organizing our supplies was our first priority. Once everything was in place, we began our hike up the hill to scout the area. We got in a fair amount of hiking and skiing before the day started to fade into the evening. At one point, Ethan and I got separated while skiing down a particularly steep hill. I assumed I would meet him at the bottom or catch up with him soon. I tried reaching him on my walkie-talkie, but there was no response. He was likely still making his way down the slope. As I wandered at the base of the hill, carrying my skis, I encountered another skier. He had a ski mask on, which concealed his face, and spoke to me in a friendly tone. He asked about the best slopes in the area and whether I was camping nearby. He had his skis strapped to an orange backpack. I pointed toward the hill I had just skied down and also indicated the direction of our campsite. He then mentioned that he and his wife were looking for a good place to set up camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite. Though I was hesitant to trek all the way back, I felt compelled to help. As we started walking, I pulled out my walkie-talkie again and announced into the speaker that I was heading back to camp for a bit. Suddenly, I picked up some static from the other end. It seemed like Ethan was trying to reach me, but the connection was poor. There was nothing I could do except return to the hill later. After a decent amount of hiking and small talk, we reached the campsite. I turned to the man and smiled under my ski mask, which I quickly realized was pointless since he couldn't see it. He thanked me, but something about his demeanor shifted. I finally asked, "Where's your wife?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer to me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about his skis and backpack caught my attention. They belonged to Ethan. For a split second, I thought, is this Ethan? Is he pranking me? But that wasn't possible. The voice was too different. Now, just a few feet away, the man quickened his pace toward me, his approach suddenly more aggressive. Panic surged through me. I dove into the tent, frantically searching for my flare gun in my bag. Just as I found it, I felt a sharp, electrifying pain in my leg, a searing, burning sensation. I screamed in agony as I yanked the flare gun free, pushed the tent door aside, and aimed it at the man. He immediately backed up, his hands raised. That's when I saw it. A knife was lodged deep into my leg. Through gritted teeth, I ordered him to tell me where Ethan was. "Near the bottom of the hill where I found you," he answered quickly. I told him to stay put while I called for help, but before I could dial, he bolted into the darkness. There was nothing I could do to chase after him. not with my leg bleeding profusely and the bitter cold numbing my body. I clutched my walkie-talkie, but the connection was still too poor to reach Ethan. My only option was to wait. The minutes dragged by like hours, and the cold gnawed at me. But finally, the reassuring sound of a rescue helicopter roared overhead. With my last ounce of strength, I shot my flare gun into the sky. I couldn't believe it. They actually found me. As I was lifted into the helicopter, I spotted Ethan lying in the snow, motionless. Relief and fear clashed in my chest as the medics located him. He was unconscious, his leg also stabbed twice. He had been robbed, left to freeze in the snow. Later, Ethan told me he had been trying to reach me through the walkie-talkie while he was losing consciousness, but the signal was too weak. We were both rushed to the hospital, but in the end, we survived. To this day, I can't stop wondering, who was that man? And what would have happened if I hadn't had my flare gun? Story number 8. It was a late weekday night, and I had stepped out onto the front porch of my apartment complex to smoke a cigarette or two. I had been up studying for hours, so I brought my textbook with me, laying down on the stairs as I took slow drags from my cigarette. The apartment complex was located within walking distance from the bar and downtown area, making it a common spot for people returning home late at night. As I sat there flipping through the pages, a girl I had never met before arrived. She lived in the apartment one unit over from mine on the ground floor. I could tell from the way she walked that she had been drinking. She barely managed to get inside her apartment when a man appeared out of nowhere and knocked on her door. She opened it, and I immediately noticed that he introduced himself, which was odd considering it was nearly 2:30 in the morning. Who shows up unannounced at a random girl's apartment at that hour? Something about the situation didn't sit right with me, so I decided to stay outside and keep an eye on things. Their conversation dragged on for more than 10 minutes. Later, she admitted to me that she had found it strange but didn't know how to end it. The man was acting oddly, stroking her hair multiple times and slowly inching his way closer to her through the doorway. His behavior gave me chills. To make sure he knew he wasn't alone with her, I deliberately shuffled my textbook and made some noise. Just as suddenly as he had arrived, he vanished into the night. We called the police, and a few days later, both the girl and I sat with a sketch artist to describe the man. As soon as the sketch was made public, calls flooded in. It turned out the guy was a serial rapist who targeted women coming home from bars, often pretending to be a cab driver offering rides. The girl had been lucky. Her apartment was close enough to the bars that he never got the chance to lure her into his car. I've only used Craigslist once in my life, and that one experience left me with a sour taste in my mouth. Story number 9. I had found an ad for a ping pong table that seemed like a great deal for my roommate and me. I contacted the seller, and we arranged a time for me to pick it up that evening. To ensure it would fit, I had to remove the back seats of my truck before heading over. When I arrived at his house, I sent him a text. "I'm here." The front door opened moments later, so I quickly hopped out of my truck and made my way to the entrance. I extended my hand for a handshake, but the man either didn't see it or ignored it. After a few awkward seconds, I dropped my hand back down. With a deep, raspy smoker's voice, he told me to follow him to the basement where the ping pong table was stored. The house had a peculiar scent, not necessarily unpleasant, but a mix of cotton and smoke. Once we reached the basement, the table was right in the center of the room. Then, suddenly, he muttered, "Oh, shoot, I gotta find the paddles," before dashing back up the stairs. "Just wait here," he added over his shoulder. I stood there, assuming he had misplaced them and was searching for them upstairs. After a few minutes, curiosity got the best of me, and I began glancing around. Something felt off. Framed pictures decorated the basement, but they were all of him. No family, no friends. There was one photo with a dog, but that was about it. After 10 minutes, I grew restless and started looking around further. A small laundry/storage room in the back caught my attention. As I peered inside, I noticed a slightly open drawer in a utility desk. Without thinking, I pulled it open all the way. Inside were old Polaroid pictures, disturbing ones. The images depicted a young woman bound to a chair with tape over her mouth. My heart pounded in my chest. Next to the photos were a row of yellow folders labeled A to Z. I couldn't bring myself to open them. I grabbed my phone, intending to take pictures of the drawer's contents and send them to my friends immediately. But when I checked, I had no service. That was my breaking point. I needed to leave. I bolted toward the stairs, but my nightmare worsened when I realized the door was locked. The deep, raspy voice of the man drifted through the door. "Sorry about that. Must have locked by accident. Let me go grab the key real quick." I didn't respond. Instead, I examined the keyhole and ran back downstairs, rifling through his utility desk. I grabbed 3 screwdrivers of different sizes and tried them one by one. The smallest screwdriver barely fit, but I managed to turn it just enough to unlock the door. I didn't waste another second. I sprinted out of the house and into my truck, speeding off without looking back. Once I was a safe distance away, I drove straight to the nearest police station. I showed them the pictures I had taken, gave them the house's address, and told them where they could find the photos and folders. That was enough for them to start an investigation. A few days later, I received an update. The man had been arrested. He was part of a child exploitation ring operating on the dark web. That's how he made his living. Why he decided to lock me in his basement is still a mystery. What he intended to do with me, I have no idea. But I have never used Craigslist since, and I never will again. Story number 10. When I was 14, I used to babysit to earn extra money. One particular time, I was hired to watch a 6-year-old boy named Lucas. His parents gave me very few instructions, just to order pizza for dinner and to make sure he didn't go into their bedroom. Before leaving, they also mentioned something odd. Lucas tended to act differently from other kids. They said he often talked to himself or to his imaginary friend, especially while playing with his toys. It was a rainy afternoon, and the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. I sat on the couch watching an old Wipeout episode while Lucas played on the floor, surrounded by his scattered toys. As he played, he kept saying the name Mia, as if he were talking to someone. He acted like there was another child sitting across from him, playing along. Then, something happened that made my stomach drop. A toy on the other side of the room suddenly activated by itself. It was one of those crank-operated cube toys that displayed a racing scene when wound up. The thing required effort to turn on, yet there it was, moving all on its own. I stared at it, confused. "Lucas, how did that happen?" Without hesitation, he looked up at me and said, "Mia is playing with it." A chill ran down my spine. Trying to shake off the uneasiness, I picked up the toy and switched it off. Later that night, as I waited for his parents to return, I went to the bathroom to wash up. While I was inside, I heard a soft knock on the door. "Lucas?" I called. No response. I opened the door, expecting to see him standing there, but he wasn't. The hallway was empty. My eyes drifted toward the far end of the hall, where one of the bedroom doors began to creak open, slowly, inch by inch, as if someone was pushing it from the inside. I turned off the bathroom light and cautiously stepped toward the room, half expecting Lucas to jump out and scare me. Instead, I found him sitting on the bed in the far corner of the room, staring at me. My skin prickled with fear. "Who just opened the door?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Mia did," he said. A wave of dread washed over me. That was it, I was done. I quickly picked him up off the bed and carried him to the living room, where I stayed with him for the rest of the night. When his parents finally returned, I didn't mention any of the strange things that had happened. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. A few weeks later, they reached out and asked if I could babysit again. I never called them back.